Hello, guys. Whoa. Can I talk today? Okay. Yeah, I can talk today. Hey guys, welcome back. It's been a little while, but okay. So I've been planning this for a little while because after I put up my last video, I watched it and I was like, that's ridiculous. I don't know. I mean, I felt like it was really just like, this is what you can't do, this is what you can't do, this is why. So I wanted to film another video with a more like a solutions-based approach to tell you how you can actually get your pots into a kiln. So here we go. I've got some notes down here, so that's why I'm looking. Okay, so the first thing is who you should ask. So there's going to probably be a kiln somewhere in your community. You'd be actually surprised who has kilns. So there's the obvious ones. There's community studios. So that's like our studio, Pottery to the People, where you can take classes or you can become a member or any of those types of setups. Obviously they have a kiln. The second obvious one is a local potter. You can definitely reach out to them. If they have a website, you can look online and oftentimes they will have information about whether or not they do this service. Although of course not all potters have websites, so you might just figure out how you can reach out and ask them. So there's those two. And then there's things that you might not think about so much. So schools, like grade schools, universities, high schools, those types of things, they often also have kilns because, in grade school and even in high school, you usually have art class. And then the last thing that you could think about is like a community center. So this could be like a after-school program, so like a rec center, or like a senior home or something like that, where people in the community come together and do like activities. So you can reach out to them if they have pottery classes there. Maybe you want to take a class there just to figure out kind of like how things work, to befriend the teacher. How to ask is something else. So I would just be really open with them and reach out. I wouldn't go ahead and first buy, this is what I talked about in my last video, don't go online, don't go to Amazon, buy some clay and then make something and then just like deliver it to that person. That is, definitely going to turn the potter in charge off. So just before you make anything, ask them. Ask them, do you fire outside clay? If they do, how does it work? What kind of temperature it fires to? Small tangent, temperatures. So if you don't know what temperature your clay fires to, this is like a little red flag for people who own kilns. Know your clay. So even if you buy your clay from Amazon or wherever, the local craft store, it's going to say on the packaging what temperatures it should fire to. So know that. Don't expect the potter to know because clay fires at all these different temperatures. At least look on the package and read what the package says, and you can reach out to the potter and say, do you fire to this temperature? Now this is if you already have the clay. A better solution would be to go to the potter first and ask them what temperature they fire to, and then buy clay in that temperature. They can also probably refer you to a better source to buy your clay than Amazon. So yeah, like to a ceramic supplier or something that you may not know if you're not a potter. So reach out to the potter, I guess, before you buy anything, and make sure you have a place to fire your work because what a bummer would it be that you spent all these hours to make some beautiful pottery and then you weren't able to actually fire it in the end because that potter fires to a different temperature. So no one likes that. That's really sad. So another thing that I briefly mentioned was the size of the kiln. So definitely don't make pottery that's like gonna be too big for their kiln, especially if you're reaching out to like a hobby potter. Some hobby potters have like very small kilns, like 30 centimeters by 30 centimeters, like a foot by a foot. Everything needs to fit in the kiln. So ask the temperature, ask the kiln dimensions. Some other basic things that you should know about firing pottery is that you don't want to make the walls of the pot too thick. So I always tell people no thicker than 2 centimeters. That's a little bit less than an inch. And the reason for this is obviously because of air holes, because of drying times. You don't want to have explosions in the kiln. Thick walls is like the main cause of having things explode in the kiln. Also important is don't add anything to the clay. So don't put in beads, don't put in wire, don't put in, newspaper or anything. This is actually kind of a dangerous part because if you don't use the right materials, things can melt and destroy all that valuable stuff inside of the kiln, or it can cause an amazing amount of smoke if you put in like I had a friend put in sponge, like a lot of sponge into a kiln once, and the fire department actually arrived because there was smoke billowing out the windows. So that can be really bad. So just don't add anything to the clay. Just put clay in the kiln, unless the potter offers something. Obviously trust the potter. Oh, and then something that sometimes beginner potters don't know is that like the bottom is usually unglazed. So this is for all pottery, including the manufactured pottery from factories and stuff. Always the bottom is unglazed. Check your pots at home. The reason for that is because inside the kiln the glaze liquefies, and if it's going to touch anything, it's going to glue to that thing. If you've ever had two pots that are touching each other in the kiln, they will melt into each other. So this is totally normal for pots and stuff, but you might want to keep that in mind if you're going to make like something like beads. Beads are a little bit tricky because the bottom will stay unglazed unless you have like a specific armature or something. So if you have a specific project that's a little tricky, just ask the potter that you're going to fire your works at. Okay, now, next thing. So transporting pottery is always kind of a problem. It's hard enough to transport the pots that you've just made to the studio without them breaking. That's really hard already. But what's nearly impossible is transporting a glazed piece that's done with traditional glazes to a studio for glazing without the glaze falling off, because that's like really, you touch it and it comes off. Now this is with like the most common glazes, which are called, well, I call them dipping glazes, dipping or pouring glazes. So you see this on pottery videos where the person has their pot on some tongs or just with their fingers and they dip it into a vat of glaze. This is like what most potters do if they're not spraying on their glazes. So this is not ideal for if you're glazing from home. For glazing from home, I would recommend paint-on glazes. Paint-on glazes are a little bit more expensive, but the reason for this is because they have some extra ingredients in them that are making them sticky, and those ingredients are a bit expensive. So you will get like a little container of glaze, like liquid form, like that's the key. Dipping glazes are usually coming in powder, paint-on glazes are usually coming in liquid form, and then you just paint it on and it's actually gonna stay on your piece. So this is if you have to glaze from home. Now, if you have a very kind potter, they may allow you to keep your glaze in the studio, like a bucket of glaze in the studio, and glaze there. So like, you're coming to pick up the bisque, you glaze it real quick, and then it can go straight back into the kiln for glaze firing. I was lucky enough to, when I first came to Berlin, have this sort of setup where I kept a bucket of glaze in the potter's kiln where I was firing at. This is before I had a studio and I was making stuff at home. And he let me glaze in the studio quickly before, I was always like really mindful of like making sure I wasn't taking up too much space, doing it really quickly. And also I only had one bucket. I was just using a transparent glaze at the time. So I just had one bucket, and it wasn't a big deal for him to store that one bucket for me. So just ask the potter. I mean, I think it's different. This was a private studio that was pretty big. So it wasn't that big of a deal for him. Obviously a school setting might be different or whatever. So just ask. Otherwise, you can always default to paint-on glazes. Yeah. And a cool thing about paint-on glazes is you can get all sorts of different colors, like more than the dipping glazes. So you might want to choose that anyway. Okay, last point I want to remind you of is that every kiln fires differently. So curb your expectations a little bit, especially for the first firing. Always do tests, right? So if you're firing in a new kiln with a new glaze, don't glaze, all of these pieces that you've spent, hours and hours on manufacturing, like glaze one, put it in there, or glaze a couple, or you can glaze them all, just don't expect them to turn out how they're gonna look like on the catalog. So never does it look like the glaze swatch on the catalog, like never does it look like how it's gonna look like in real life, like in your pots, in your kiln. Every kiln fires differently. We have 2 kilns in the same space and they fire differently. Whereas if someone had my exact kiln in a different space, it could also fire differently because of the temperature curve. Like every potter does it sort of different. Also, the water in the glaze can, change in different places in the city or in the country or in the world, and that will also affect your glaze, like the chemistry in the water. So don't expect your glazes to look like how they look like in the catalog. And also, if you're a newbie, expect things to crack, expect things to explode, everything that can go wrong in ceramics will go wrong. Now, I still have things that go wrong, and I've been doing this for 10 years. Pottery is fickle, but the reason it's so fickle, the reason that we love it so much is because of that, it's just kind of like magic, and you don't really have that much control over it. Relax and be okay with flaws, and be okay with oh, I have to redo that now. It's part of it, so if you're a beginner, don't expect, especially if you're a beginner, don't expect things to go wrong when someone who's been doing this for 40 years still has something going wrong. Pottery is hard, but it's so worth it when things go right. It's amazing. So yeah, I'm going to go to the studio now, and I will talk to you guys later. Bye. This video to show you how you can actually. What do we say?